I, Ever Josephine Staley Bass, was born April 25, 1908, in Brownwood, Texas, in a tiny three-room, what was known then as a shotgun house, which means two main rooms and a lean-to kitchen which ran the full length of the two rooms. A porch in front of the two main rooms also ran the full length of these two main rooms. These kind of houses were very prominent in our part of the country. They were unpainted and most often unpapered. The walls that separated the two rooms were 1 by 12 plank boards. At night, as the children were in bed, but Mom and Papa were still up, the light from the coal oil lamp shone through the cracks of the 1 by 12 boards. This is one of the earliest recollections of my life. Grandfather Staley had built this house for Papa and Mama and shared his farm with us. It wasn't a very large farm. In fact, I wonder how it could have supported two people. But it supported, if you could call it support, 8 people, 10 people, because before we left there, Mom and Dad had 6 children, and then, of course, Grandma and Grandpa were still living. Grandfather, who was George Washington Staley, was born in Evansville, Indiana, November 10, 1837. He married Martha Ann Davis and moved first to Tarrant County, Texas. He had a spell of sickness there and blamed the climate for it. He then moved farther west into Brownwood County and homesteaded land some 5 miles northeast of Brownwood. This is where my father, William David, was born, and also where my 2 sisters, 3 brothers, and I were born. I still have at this time, which is July 5th, 1977, I still feel a close tie to this land and to my birthplace. Though I moved from there when I was only 9 years old, I never did have as strong attraction for any other place as I did our old home place, as humble as it was and as poor as we were. We couldn't have had over 20 acres, I would think, to farm, and then Dad, of course, tried to get odd jobs at other places, and then he preached, and quite often, as he would hold meetings, he seldom got over $25, if that much, for a meeting, and quite often not that much, but sometimes he'd bring home a pig or a bushel of potatoes or some sort of produce that the people, they too were very poor, would help to bear the expenses of the meeting. Most all of these meetings, when we were at Brownwood, were within driving distance, and when I say driving distance, he had a little 2-wheel cart that was pulled by 1 horse, and a tiny seat, and then down by his feet he carried his books and his notes and so on, and always stayed in the homes of one of the families in the community where he preached. Grandpa Staley was especially dear to us kids. Now, we loved Grandma, but there was no foolishness with her. In fact, I don't ever recall seeing my grandmother smile. She was good to us, and always at Christmas remembered us with gifts. It may have just been a pencil box that she paid no more than 10 cents for, or a handkerchief, or something like that, but always we had gifts from Grandma at Christmas. Now, Granddad Staley was something else. He was fun to be with. We adored him. He played with us. He played tricks on us. He was a practical jokester, and he was always playing tricks on us, but we adored him for it. The lane, what we called a lane, out in front of our house was quite sandy, and it was one of our favorite places to play in, especially after a rain when the sand was still damp, and we would make sand castles, and they would be, all of us would use our foot to bury our, we'd put our foot in the sand and then pat the sand over it and then carefully pull our foot out. And then we'd break off weeds or tiny wildflowers, and we'd make flower gardens and all of these things. Invariably, if Grandpa came along on his horse, which he quite often did, just before he'd get to us, he'd close his eyes and he'd say, "I'm an old blind man." And then he'd let his horse walk straight through those sandcastles. We would yell at him, but we could hear him chuckling all the way down the road. And we loved him for it. Even though he did destroy our sandcastles, we loved him for it. One of the great events in our lives, this happened a number of times. It was the times when Aunt Georgia and Uncle Jeff Hughes and all their children would come and visit with Grandpa. Quite often they'd stay for a long length of time, and so we grew up being very close to the Hughes cousins, as well as to the King cousins who lived right across the field from us. Grandpa, again, the more grandchildren he had around him, it seemed the more joy he got in life, and the more tricks he played on us. He would just really scare us. He could tell the most blood-chilling ghost stories, and he'd have us just entranced with those, and we would just be quaking inwardly. And then he would offer a nickel for anyone that would run around the house and count 10 at every corner. Well, not very many of us would do this, and especially after the ghost story. George Hughes was the bravest of the lot, and Grandpa knew he was. And so George would go around the house, and we'd hear him. Grandpa made him count loudly, and he would count 10 and go to the next corner and so on, and then come in and claim his nickel. Now, a nickel doesn't sound much to children in this day and time, but a nickel to a child then was like having, say, $50 given to a child today. And so George, if he was afraid, he didn't let on. But now his older brother, Lawrence, was quite different. He was so afraid. But seeing George with the nickel, he decided one night that he would try. This was always, of course, at night time. And Lawrence started around the house, and he got to the first corner, and we heard him count 10. And then by the time that he got to the second corner, now this sounds cruel to us today, and it was cruel, Grandpa hollered, "Sick him, Pat." Pat was the bulldog. And we heard Lawrence scream. And poor Lawrence, I don't recall if Grandpa gave him the nickel or not. He certainly deserved it. But never again did he go around that house, nor none of the rest of us, and count 10 at each corner. Well, this was typical of Grandpa. We worked hard on this farm. Ordinarily, we began work in the fields by the time we were 4 years old. Of course, if Mama went to the field, then the child that was old enough to see after the baby would stay in the house with the baby and occasionally the two youngest children. But if she didn't go to the field, by the time we were 4 years old, we were put in the field to pick cotton. Cotton picking was a very difficult task. The weather would be, I'm sure, sometimes 100 degrees because we picked in the latter part of August and in September, which are very hot months. We had to do this in order to exist. As I said, many of these things will seem very cruel to people in this day and time, but it had to be in order to eat. And if any child was found loitering in the field, playing, not picking very fast, it wouldn't be long until they'd fill cotton stalks across their back. Dad would come back, he'd hear us playing, and he knew about how fast we could pick. And he'd come back and he would whip us with a cotton stalk, and it hurt too, across the back. So we learned early to accept responsibility. I look back on those days actually as a very rich heritage. It taught us to put a great value on money, and being responsible in every area of our lives. Though we were punished like that, we had a very close-knit family. We loved each other. We enjoyed each other. We quarreled a lot, as many children do today, but still there was a loyalty among all of us, and a very strong affection toward our parents. We never felt badly toward our parents for punishing us so severely, whether it would be in the field or as running through an ash heap, as I did one time with my shoes on. I did not know that ashes would eat your shoes, would destroy your shoes. And I was having great fun where we carried the ashes out of both the cook stove and the heater, and it had stacked up in quite a big pile. And it was a lot of fun to run through it and pick up the ashes. And Mama happened to come out and see me doing this. And she pulled a big switch off the tree, and she gave me one good switching. Again, that sounds cruel, but never again did I run through the ash heap. It was a lesson that I had to be taught. Lessons had to be taught one time. They didn't have time to over and over again say, don't do that, and then the child just ignore it. They were taught one time, then never again was the offense repeated. Aunt Nell and Uncle Charlie King, as I said a while ago, lived across the field from us. They had 4 children, and all of these children were younger than all of us, with the exception of my youngest brother, Frank. We had, though they were younger, we thoroughly enjoyed them, and we liked to go to Aunt Nell's, and we were over there a great deal of our time in those times of the year when there was no field work to be done. We especially liked to visit Aunt Nell's, and often quarreled over who was going to get to visit Aunt Nell on Easter night. We were, as I said, we were very poor. Aunt Nell and Uncle Charlie were a little bit better off because Uncle Charlie didn't depend on the farm for a living. He worked for the telephone company, and his brother Hugh lived with him, and Hugh ran the farm. Uncle Charlie had and supplemented the farm with his salary, so they had a better living than the average person that lived in that community. And on Easter, he had store-bought eggs or something or other for Happy, and that was before the other children came along, and I'm sure he did for the other children too. And if one of us kids spent the night there, he always remembered the one that stayed and had things for them also. Now at our house, the only thing that we did for Easter, and this is all that Mama could afford to do, we never had eggs for breakfast. This was a luxury that we couldn't afford. But on Easter, Mama usually boiled a dozen eggs or more and never colored them. They were just plain eggs. But she would take them out and hide them, usually all in one nest, out in the woods somewhere, and she'd put them all together, and then we'd all go out to search for the eggs, and then eat them later. And this was a delight. This was great. This was something unusual because, as I said, it was so seldom that we got to eat an egg. We had chickens, yes, but Mama sold the eggs in order to get other staple goods, flour, sugar, syrup, that the family, she felt, needed more than they needed the eggs. But I recall one time that May spent the Easter night with Aunt Nell and Uncle Charlie, And when she came home, oh, she had a darling little candy hand. Was made, I presume, of rock candy, and was about 3 inches across, and 3 or 4 inches across, and about 3 inches across, about 2.5 inches high. And with its red comb, and it was a white chicken, but if I recall right, it had a red comb and beady eyes. She was so proud of it, and she wouldn't have dared eating this chicken. And she went straight to her trunk with it. May was the only one of us that ever had a trunk. Mom and Dad had a big trunk. And when she was 13, they gave her this trunk. And she went straight to her trunk with it and put it in the till of the trunk. Well, I don't know who it was that got in there, but someone dropped the hen and broke its head off. Still, she wouldn't eat it, or wouldn't let us eat it. She put the broken head, and the rest of the chicken back in her trunk, and there it stayed for years and years. But I learned when May wasn't watching to flip into the trunk and suck the tail of this chicken. That was the part that fit in my mouth easiest. And she never did know about it, because such a little bit would come off, but still I'd get a little sugar. Children didn't have candy back in those days. It was a most unusual thing that we would get any candy. When I was 8, well, actually for quite a period of time before I was 8, there was a long drought. They called it the 7-year drought in Brownwood, and we never did make just real good crops. And as I said earlier, we had to depend on extra work that Dad did. But in 1917, they had bumper crops out in Tarrant County, where my mother's people lived. Grandma and Grandpa McFadden, and then Mama's brothers, all had just bumper crops in cotton. And so Uncle Harv needed hands, and he had an automobile. We didn't get a car until I was out of high school. But we went everywhere in a wagon, with being pulled by 2 horses. Seldom did we go to church any nearer than 5 miles, and quite often it was 9 to 12 miles on Sunday. But we went to church every Sunday that Dad was there. Now, when Dad was away, if the weather allowed, well, Mama gathered all of us up, and we usually went into church at Brownwood. But this drought, as I said, drove us out, and Uncle Harv came down in his, I believe it was a Briscoe at that time that he had, and Mama and, all the children went with him, Mom and the children, and Dad came out, I believe, in the wagon at that time, so we would have some means of going to church when we got there. And so we picked cotton for Uncle Harv in that year, the fall of 1917. And then when cotton picking time was over, well, we made the trek back to Brownwood, and I don't recall his taking us back. We may have all gone back in the covered wagon. And then when we got there, well, our cotton was just about not over 4 inches high, and would have a bowl on it here and there, but we gathered what little cotton we had and saved it that probably didn't even have $100 worth. But nevertheless, we picked this cotton after we got back home. We went to a 2-teacher school. We walked 5 miles, walked a railroad track, and it was quite cold in the winter. And this track was an elevated track, and so, of course, the north wind really hit us as we walked to school. I recall one time on our way to school, it had been told to us that and the tracks would be frosty. Oh, just nearly every morning in the winter, the tracks would be covered with frost. And I'd always heard if you stuck your tongue to the railroad track, that it would stick to the tracks. Well, I didn't believe it, and I gave it a try, and sure enough, my tongue stuck. And instead of blowing my breath down on there and releasing my tongue, I just jerked back, and it pulled all the top skin off. Really was painful. that was one of the few things that happened to us as we went back and forth to school. There was a cemetery, our family cemetery, called the Staley Cemetery, that was just back of our house. My granddaddy Staley had given this land to the community to bury the people there in the community. And that was one of the places where we played. There was one group of graves that had a rock fence around it. And this fence was about a foot wide, I guess. The top stones were smoothed off, and was about wide enough for us to walk on. And we used to play Pussy Wants the Corner on this on this fence that went around these special graves. Now we have a lot of kin people that are buried there now. Grandma and Grandpa Staley are buried there. Uncle John Staley is buried there. Aunt Nell and Uncle Charlie King are buried there. What used to be Billy Chisholm, which was my first cousin, her husband is buried there. Hugh King, Uncle Charlie's brother, is buried there, and as well as Uncle Charlie's parents. And I don't know, of course, so many of the people in the neighborhood. Aunt Georgia and Uncle Jeff Hughes are buried there. And so many of the people that I knew when I was a child in this community are buried in this little cemetery. So this place still has a very close affection in my heart. Now, the following year, in 1918, again, the drought held on. And so Dad decided to move to Arlington. He didn't want to. He was very afraid of rearing his children between those two wicked cities. Uncle Harv had talked a lot about how wicked Fort Worth and Dallas were, and Dad just thought it was Sodom and Gomorrah. And he really dreaded rearing his children between the two cities. Arlington was about 14 miles out of Fort Worth. But he didn't have much choice because, as I said, he didn't have enough land to make us a living in the first place, and it looked like there just was not going to be any rain in Brownwood. So in the fall of 1918, Uncle Harv again came down and took us out, and all but Bob and Dad. And Bob rode in the covered wagon with Dad and all of our household goods in that tiny little wagon. I don't know how they did it because those wagons they were regular farm wagons, but they wouldn't hold much. But I do remember they're building what they called overjets. And this was a board that they nailed onto the side of the wagon, boards on each side of the wagon, about a 12-inch board. And, of course, it had supports. And then you could pack things on top of that, and he was able to get a few more things in than he otherwise would. We were real excited over going, riding the automobile again and moving to Tarrant County. So we moved in a little 3-room house close to Uncle Harv and Jessie. Jessie was my daddy's niece who had married my mother's brother. So we were double kin to them. And we picked cotton that fall, hard work. And we stayed out of school until the harvest was all in. And in fact, for many years, until I was a 10th grader, we stayed out of school usually until October or November, really November, because school usually would have gone on about 2 months before we would get to start. On rainy days, we would get to go to school. We got our books on the first day of school, and we tried to study at home. And then when it rained, well, we'd get to go to school. So, of course, school was a delight to us, and we kids were always glad to see it rain, because that meant no field work, and it also meant that we got to go to school and be with our friends. At night, we sat around the table, and Dad had our lessons. He always had us study, and then he would have us tell him the things that we studied. We studied by a coal oil lamp, which gives little more light than a lighted match or a lighted candle. I cannot understand now, when I light a coal oil lamp that I have here, I cannot understand how we could have seen well enough to have read anything. It gives such a little bit of light. But that's what people had back in those days, and we usually had a lamp on either side of the room. Of course, the room wasn't very big, and with both lights, it sufficed, and we studied our lessons at night. I always made good grades. I don't know what the other kids did, but I know for myself that I always made good grades. I studied hard, and I was determined, and in fact my mother, over and over again, my mother was not a doddlehead, I'll say that, but she would classify herself as that. And she'd say, "Oh, study hard, get your education, and don't be an old doddlehead like me." Well, I didn't know exactly what a doddlehead was, but it didn't sound very complimentary. So I more than went out to study my lessons, and I made good grades. And when we moved into the Arlington schools, again, it was October before we got to start school, and this was town school. But within 2 months, I was on the honor roll. I studied constantly. I don't suppose I wasted 5 minutes of my time in the schoolroom, because I had to work hard to catch up. And then, too, this school was a school of well-dressed children. They were different from the ones we had gone to school with in the country, and I had such a inferior complex. Didn't make friends, with the exception of some few children that had also moved in to go to school. And since it was difficult for me to make friends, I spent that time in study, and I guess it was just as well that I did. I graduated in 1925 and stayed out 1 year, worked at S.H. Cress and Company for $9 a week. Well, first, in the summertime, my mother went to a chain store called Hudson and Davis downtown, down in Arlington, and asked the manager to let me work for free just to get the experience of working. Bess had gotten a job after she graduated a year before I did, and she worked in a grocery store for $50 a month, and she turned it all into the family to help support the family. So Mama knew that I guess I was out of school then, and she asked Mr. Knapp if I could work, and that I wouldn't charge him anything, that I just wanted the experience. So I worked 2 weeks for no pay at all, and at the end of 2 weeks, well, he told Mama I was worth some pay, and he started paying me $6 a week. And then the following year, that must have been my junior year, I can't recall, or senior year, the summer of the senior year. And then in the fall, I went to Dallas. May and Hubert were living in Dallas, and I got a job at S.H. Cress and Company for $9 a week. I paid May and Hubert $2 a week for board. I rode the streetcar to work, bought my lunch, bought my clothes, and Dad couldn't understand why I wasn't sending money home to help support the family. After I paid May and Hubert the board, it was only $7, and then it was about 20 cents a day for, I believe it was 10 cents car fare, 20 cents a day for car fare. So I thought I did pretty well to support myself. Well, after Christmas was over, they laid off all of the extra help that they had put on, and I was laid off and went back to the Arlington. But this time Dad had rented this farm. It was a Sandyland farm north of Arlington, what is very close to what is called Six Flags now, not too far from Six Flags. And then I went back to work in the fields. And the following winter, thanks to that darling Beth, my sister Beth, that was making $50 a month, She borrowed $100, and I went to college at what is now Arlington, University of Texas at Arlington, but then was called North Texas Agricultural College. You could go 1 year and get a teacher's certificate and start teaching. So I went 1 year, but there were so many teachers, more teachers than there were schools, and I didn't get a school that year. So I went into Fort Worth and got a job with Montgomery Ward for, $10 a week. I worked till just before Christmas, and when we were at our busiest then. But that company didn't want to pay for the holidays, and so they laid us all off. And the week before Christmas, they laid us all off so they wouldn't have to pay us for Christmas Day. And I went to W.C. Stripling, which was a big department store, and found work there at $12 a week. And again was laid off after Christmas and went back to the farm. Well, the following year, I could not go to school again. This was a junior college, but I didn't have the money to go back to school. And I went out to Johnson Station, where I had gone to school when I was a child, and went to Mrs. Barden's, who was one of the trustees of the school, and asked her for a place on the school. And she said there was no opening, but she would go with me to a place called Rendon, which was she had taught school when she was a young girl, and this was the first school that she'd ever taught. And she would take me there and see if she could get me on there. So we drove to Rendon, and we found out who the trustees were. And it so happened the very first trustee that we entered their home, when she told who she was, this trustee's wife just threw her arms around her neck, and she said, "Oh, Miss B, you were the best teacher I ever had in my life." And this trustee's wife had been one of her former students. And then we went on and visited the other trustees, and I was hired there to teach school the following year. Well, this was when my life really made a change. Dad had been so strict on us at home. People were getting their hair cut. Women and girls wore long hair. In fact, I had never had short hair. I had worn long hair all of my life. And when I was in high school, nearly everyone had short hair, but some few of us that belonged to the church still had our long hair, because we had been taught it was wrong for a woman to have short hair. And one by one, the church girls began to cut their hair, but Dad still wouldn't let us cut ours. And I remember one day, one of my girlfriends that went to church where I did walked in with her hair cut. And I looked at that door that she came in, and I said, "I'm going to have my hair cut when I walk through that door tomorrow." I stood out like a sore thumb. I wore my hair in a pigtail down my back, plaited down my back. And practically everyone else had short hair. They cut it parted down the middle with bangs and then straight around. Well, I went home and I asked Mama. And she said, "Well, now you'll just have to ask your Daddy." And I thought, oh, I've got Mama's consent. I know I'll get, with her behind me, I'll get Dad's. But I had another think coming. Dad said emphatically, no one would get their hair cut as long as they lived under his roof. And I began to cry. And he said, "You can cry until you're 77 years old, and you're not going to get your hair cut." So I went back to school next day with my pigtail hanging down my back. Well, that was when I was in the 10th grade, and later on in the year, well, one of the elders' daughters had her hair cut. And Bess always had a way with Dad that none of the rest of us kids did. And she wanted her hair cut too, but she never had said anything about it until then. And she went home and she said, "Well, Dad, Edith Lightfoot has her hair cut." And Dad said, "Well, I guess it's no greater sin to want to do something, to have it done, than it is to want to so badly. And I'll let you girls have your hair cut, but you're not going to the barber shop." We didn't have beauty shops at that time. Well, I guess we did too. But certainly there was no going to the beauty shops. And most everyone went to the barber shop to have their hair cut. Well, he wouldn't let us go to the barber shop, so when Bess went to school, well, some girl was able to cut her hair, and they cut her hair. Then she cut my. I was ill and didn't get mine cut, but when I was able to be up, well, Bess cut my hair, and I cut it parted down the middle with what we call Buster Brown, but I didn't overlook the fact because Bess told me I couldn't wear it that way because I had a cowlick, and my bangs would kick up on one side. But nevertheless, I insisted on her cutting my hair with bangs, and at night I would put a band around my head to hold those bangs down, and it never lasted till I got to school. That cowlick, those bangs would still come up. But it was quite some time before I would let my bangs grow out. Well, in fact, I was in college, I guess, before I let them grow out. Not only would Dad not let us wear short hair for such a long period of time, but he wouldn't let us wear lipstick or rouge. And all the girls wore rouge and lipstick. And I recall a number of times finding red crepe paper and wetting it and rubbing it across my lips, and managed to get by a little bit like that. But no lipstick, no rouge. He wouldn't let us. Everybody wore sleeveless dresses. Sleeveless dresses came in, but he would not let us wear sleeveless dresses. We had to wear dresses to our elbows. He was quite dictatorial, and we accepted it until after I was out of high school, and then I became rather rebellious because I just could not see any reason in this when everyone else was dressing so differently, and it certainly did increase my inferior complex. Well, beginning with when I went to college, I made some real good friends, and I thoroughly enjoyed that year at North Texas Agricultural College. And then, of course, as I worked some in the town, I got just a little bit better clothes. Even if I did make poor pay, I still had better clothes than I had had up to that time. And then when I went off to teach school down at Rendon, I picked cotton. That school didn't start until October. So during August and September, I picked cotton and bought cotton materials. And Mama made me dresses too, and I got my shoes and my hose and things like this to go off to school. This school was about 20 miles from Arlington, but I had to stay down there. There was no going back and forth to school, of course. I lived with a couple of spinster sisters, and I loved them very much. The only thing I had against them, they both dipped snuff, and their house was musty. They didn't air it out. They didn't take baths in the winter, and they didn't wash their hair in the winter. They thought it would just kill you if you washed your hair or you took a bath. I was brought up on one bath a week, and I still took one bath a week when I went off to school. Occasionally I would take a sponge bath midweek because our books taught us to teach the children to take at least two baths a week. And I'd take a sponge bath, but a tub bath, and I shall never forget their being just horrified at me taking a bath. And Miss Dora said, "Miss Staley, you're going to kill yourself. You'll take pneumonia taking a bath." But nevertheless, I continued to take these baths once a week. Most always, Bob would come down on Friday, and we had a Model T Ford by that time. And he'd come down on Friday and take me back home, but occasionally I would stay down there if the weather was bad. I would stay down there over the weekend, and that's when I'd take my baths down there. Harvey and Bess had bought this car, and they both married, and they left it at home. They didn't take, neither of them took the car with them, and because anything that you bought while you were at home, it stayed there. You didn't take it with you. While I was teaching, I bought what I thought was a lovely bedroom suit and fixed up my bedroom. We didn't have a living room. Our bedroom was our living room. Mama had bought a second-hand couch, and that was in there, and my bed was in there. But when I married, that bedroom suite stayed with Mom and Dad. I didn't get to take it with me. Then I was rehired for the second year, and then that year, instead of staying with these spinster ladies, there were 3 teachers in this school, a man, and then this other girl was, the teacher the first year it was a man, and he and his wife. The wife did not teach, but they had moved to that community. And then there was a married woman that lived in that community who was teaching, and then I. And this married woman became pregnant and had to give up the school. And so Gordy Ray was hired. I taught the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grades, and she taught the 4th, 5th, and 6th. He taught the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and that's as far as we taught in that school. Well, Gordy Ray, and I always called her Ray, and she'd call me Staley. We rented a room and did light housekeeping, and that's when my life made a tremendous change. We had fun. We really, we got along just beautifully with each other, and we enjoyed teaching, and we enjoyed the parties in that community. And those parties, everyone was invited. It wasn't just someone gave a party and invited a few people, but the entire community, all the kids in that community went to the parties. It was at one of these parties back in 1930, given by Mrs. Bass, that Gordy and I went this night. You didn't have to have a date to go to a party, and sometimes we dated down there, and sometimes we didn't. But we'd always manage, though we didn't have a car, we'd catch a ride with someone and go to the party. Well, on this special night, a Mrs. Bass gave the party, and kids from all over the community came. And as Ray and I arrived, well, Mrs. Bass was standing at the door greeting the guests, and her tall, dark, handsome son was standing by her side. In fact, she had given this party in his honor that he might get acquainted with the young people in that community. I thought he was the most handsome man that I had ever seen up to that time, and just about since that time, too. So we went in and sat down, and I said to Ray, "Did you notice this tall, black-headed young man that was standing at the door?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I have a feeling that that's my future husband." And she laughed and thought it was the most preposterous statement that I had made, and thought I was quite foolish, in fact, for making such a statement. And I said, "You just wait and see." This was in February of 1930. On August 16th of that same year, I married that tall, dark, and handsome young man. And within 3 more years, we will have been married 50 years. That was at the beginning of the Depression. We had not heard the word Depression at the time that we married. However, it wasn't long until we did. J.W. Bass was his name, and he's been called Jay ever since by all of his friends. He had always, up to that time, he'd always made good money. $60 a week was his last job, and that was big pay back in those days. And though he wasn't working when we married, and in fact he borrowed $10, and we drove to Oklahoma, to Marietta, Oklahoma, in the county of Love, Oklahoma, and married on this August 16th. And he had always been able to find work, and it never occurred to us but what he'd go right on. He was a sheet and metal worker at that time, and it never occurred to us but what he would get a job immediately. Well, it was many a year before he got a job. I still had my contract for teaching out at Rendon, and after we married, I was in summer school at the time we married, And we didn't tell it for about 10 days because I wanted to wait until I was out of school before I did. Stayed with his brother, Frank, and his wife, Helen. They had 3 little girls. We stayed there until school started in the fall. And I came back to Rendon, and Jay would not live off of his wife, so he stayed in Corsicana with and helped his brother. His brother was a hide dealer for Nortex Hide Company out of Fort Worth. And I went back and again roomed with Gordy Ray, and on the weekends would drive to Corsicana and spend the weekends with Jay, and back again on Monday morning to teach for the week. This went on all that year. And then, let's see, in 1930, August of 1930, so I taught that year. And then I This was very painful for me because Granny and I, for some reason or other, we never had enjoyed each other, and there wasn't a lot of love between us, and it was, I'm sure, as painful for her as it was for me. Fortunately, she was gone most of that summer, as her father, I believe it was ill, and she was gone most of the summer. The depression had gotten worse, and Jay's sister Elizabeth from Chicago had moved back home. And so we were all in there doing the best we could. We did have a garden, and Jay and I had gone to Brownwood the Christmas before, and Uncle Charlie had given us 2 pigs. So these had grown up into hogs, and we slew them and had fresh meat. I believe at the time, though, that the hogs were killed. Jay had come to Abilene. Frank had moved to Abilene by that time. And Jay had come out here, and they were trying to make a go of the hide company again. There was not enough money to support 2 families, so Jay came back to Rendon. They hired me again in the school. And Mom and Dad, Granny Bass moved into town. Mom and Dad came and took care of Barbara while I taught. Jay continued to run a hide truck out in West Texas and then back in East Texas too. And then things became better in Abilene, and we moved out to Abilene in 1934. We moved in a hide truck. And we got into town late in the night. We did not have money to go to a motel, and we slept in the bar ditch just east of Abilene, just east of what is ACC. On I believe that's Highway 351 now, but it was called Highway Well, I guess the Bankhead Highway at the time we came out. Anyway, it was the only highway that led from Fort Worth to Abilene. We, as we looked down, we were on a hill overlooking the town, and the next morning when we waked up, as we looked down over this hill into town, I said, "Oh, let's let our roots grow deep here." And indeed they have. We've been here now, let's see, that was 34, and this is 77, so we've been here 43 years. And we had a real rough time at first. We only made $10 a week. The first year that we came, we paid $10 a month house rent, and things were not so high, so we managed to get by on it. Very difficult. We were very young people. I was 26 when we came, and Jay was 27, and we had to have very well, our pleasures were things that did not cost us money. We very seldom got to go to the show, but we made good friends, especially with Pete and LaRue Gooch, and we enjoyed them a lot. We spent every weekend together, and we played 42, and our life was reasonably happy. Jay continued to fish, and he would go deer hunting occasionally. Not the first year that we came, but within a few years he was fishing and hunting, and of course that was his joy. James was born in December after we moved here in July. And again, I saved my last paycheck, and I was able to hold on to it this time and was able to pay for James's birth. We really didn't, we were extremely poor until when Jay went into the rendering business, with Frank, we started getting $60 a week. And oh my, I began looking at house plans then. I just thought we were really going to do well. And we did do better than we had before. Jay continued with the hide business, but worked extremely hard in this rendering plant business. He sold out to them and took the hide business altogether. And then later, he, in 1946, the war had just finished, and there was a need for soap, and he had access to tallow. And so he began manufacturing soap, and that was the beginning of the turnaround in our lives. He made a lot of money at first, for the first year or two, until soap got back on the market again. We could sell all that he could make. So he made good money, and we were able to do better than we ever had before. In fact, ever since then, life has been much easier.